Welcome to the SIWIKE podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SIWIKE podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. We're here with one of our new guest hosts, Narsingh Dixit, and he comes to us with a background in business and marketing, and we thought we'd have a conversation on his career path and get into how he got to his current role from where he was as a kid. So, Narsingh, why don't you start off a little bit with what you're doing now, and then we'll ask you about what you were like as a kid. So what are you up to these days?
Absolutely, Luki. Thanks a lot for having me on this podcast. Currently I'm working at Unilever as a digital growth manager, and I'm focused on growing our PRM efforts, strictly focusing on first-party data acquisition. So it's really in terms of maximizing our consumer growth to be able to leverage that for any digital marketing purposes. So I recently joined Unilever. I was previously actually in a real estate firm, so it's been an interesting sort of switch over from an industry point of view, but I've been loving it so far. It's a great company culture, and they have a lot of interesting and aggressive things lined up for the years to come.
Cool. So let's go back in time and get to what was Narsingh like as a kid? What were some like the earliest fond memories that you might have? And let's walk through the journey of how you got from there to here. So what were you like as a kid?
That's a good question. Looking back, I would say there's probably a couple of traits that have kind of stuck along with me, and probably the one that comes to mind the most is being a bit of a rebel.
Okay.
I think that's a personality trait that stuck with me when I was early on. So I grew up in Bombay, in India, for the first little chunk of my life, and then at around 9 years old, I moved to boarding school, which was also a very enriching experience overall. I would say in both of those scenarios, I think that trait definitely stuck around. And I think, looking back and even now today, that's been one of the things that has really allowed me to challenge the status quo. I always look at rules as something to be played around with to some extent to really see how far you can push the envelope. And, looking back at it now, I do think it's also one of the things that allows you to think critically, because until you start questioning the parameters around you, you're not really able to unlock a deeper level of critical thinking. So it's kind of interesting now that you asked that question. I'm kind of bridging the piece in my head in terms of how it's kind of helped me today.
Cool. And obviously, boarding school and rebel. You might think they go together, maybe not. Could you walk us through maybe an example of when that came and kind of showed the rebelliousness throughout the years? Like, do you have a story that you could share? Hopefully, a legal one.
Of course. Yeah, I think what was interesting about my boarding school, it's called Kodaikanal International School. It's a pretty well-renowned IB school in India, and when I was growing up there, because really, I joined that school in 5th grade all the way up until 12th grade. As you would imagine, boarding schools are meant to partially discipline you, kind of teach you how to be more independent, etc. And I think for the most part, it definitely did that. But I think, being a little bit rebellious, in terms of questioning the rules, questioning why things are done. One story that comes to mind was actually in 5th grade. I remember talking to my dorm parent at that time about why was it that we were, in elementary school, we were kind of, it was mandatory for us to go to church every Sunday and, go to Sunday school, etc. And I remember now at a very young age, we had a dialogue around, why was it mandatory? We talked a lot about religion at that time, because obviously, even though it was a Christian-based school, we had people from all cultures, from people from all around the world, all different backgrounds and faiths. And, I think that was a very important lesson for me, because it allowed me to know that it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to be curious. It's okay to really, challenge things that don't align with your personal beliefs. And I mean, this is just one small example in terms of how, even when I was relatively young, I was challenging things that normal kids would not worry about. It's just, oh, well, it's Sunday, this is what we normally do. But that's more on the PG side of things. Obviously, there were things that almost led me out of the school a couple of times, especially when I was younger. But in retrospect, I think boarding school is definitely something that teaches you a lot about being independent, leaning on your friends as family, learning how to think on your own 2 feet, and
Right.
really, well, in my scenario at least, it really opened me up to the world because it was an international school. So I learned a lot about different cultures when I was very young, and I think that has really helped me be more of a global citizen, so to speak, and being able to talk to anyone from around the world.
Cool. And you ended up in a degree in business, right? So what were
Right.
some of the influences along the way? And we'll probably park the rebelliousness discussions and maybe the religious discussions for another conversation. But what were some of the influences along the way that kind of led you to your route on the business side?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of business, it all kind of started, I would say, in high school when I'd first been exposed to business and management as a course,
Okay.
for the IB program. I think I really started getting fond of uh, just the concept of being able to run a business, everything that it stands for, the ability to do it by yourself or work for an organization. It's really a fundamental part of the way the world works and the way money moves.
Mhm.
So I think the concept in and of itself was very powerful. And um, along with that, another course that I was really fond of was economics.
Mhm.
And primarily at the time, I was very fond of macroeconomics. And again, this was more about big picture thinking about how a country works, what are the different policies that can be put into play. And I think obviously that goes hand in hand because you need to have a strong economic background to be able to be successful in the business. And so going into university, I knew I wanted to be in the business sphere.
Mhm.
And so it originally started off with a specialist in economics. And after kind of learning university level economics, I realized that it was not really the path I would want to live, for the rest of my life. And
Okay.
partially it was very um, focused on a lot of policies. I couldn't really see what the long term future would look like from a career standpoint. So that's really when marketing kind of came into play. And that's after first year is when I made that switch permanently.
And what was that kind of initial foray into marketing? So was it a course that you took? Was it some experience that you had, or how did the start into marketing come about?
Yeah, it's really come full circle now that I'm now that I'm in the CPG space. But to give you the inception of that idea, it actually came in my first year course that I did in marketing. I remember my professor at the time, he asked a question in class about shaving brands. And he had asked, how many shaving brands can you guys, come up with right now?
Hmm.
And I think there were up to three, but really the only one that was constantly being talked about was Gillette.
Mhm.
And he basically used that example to talk about the power of branding, the power of good marketing and branding in and of itself, and how you can really, create a category leader so strong that other competition is almost irrelevant. Obviously, now there's more competition. This was, a fairly long time ago, but we do have more brands in that category, like the Dollar Shave Club, which kind of
Mhm.
blew up, in around 10 years ago. And so I think that story was very powerful to me to really consider marketing. And then as I learned more about marketing in terms of the fundamentals, and so you could think of this as the 4 Ps, or you could think of it as more holistically in terms of all the functions that it plays. I started to realize that, obviously, as we all do, we have a stereotype about what a role is. Traditionally, people think of marketing as advertising, but
Sure.
as many people might know, that's just one small aspect of marketing. And so I think once I realized the breadth of what marketing was really doing, from product decisions to pricing decisions to obviously, advertising, promotions, and then obviously the birth of digital was kind of around my early university career. I think there was a lot of cool stuff happening, so that really kind of finalized my decision into switching there.
Cool. And was there any kind of parental support or obstacles throughout this process, or anything around you from a familial perspective, or even friends that kind of guided you or stopped you in kind of the decision process?
Yeah, I think one thing that's been one thing that my family has always questioned me about is my interest in business. So, traditionally, my family does not come from a business background, and because of that, when early on in high school, when I expressed my interest to kind of go into that sphere, they kind of asked whether that would be the correct path for me. But I think that passion was always there, and so therefore they were supportive of it. Similarly, going into business and marketing, there was sort of that question, like, is marketing the right career decision? And the reality of it is, at least at the time, marketing was, you could end up with a really good job, or you could end up with an okay job to kind of start off your marketing career. It's not as predictable as other disciplines. And so, I was willing to take that risk because, at the end of the day, I really thought that it was a pretty interesting, category for me from a development perspective. And yeah, from a friend standpoint, because I was in U of D at the Scarborough campus, I think 99% of my friends were in accounting or finance.
Okay.
So it was definitely, I was definitely the outcast in that sense, in terms of going into a field that was not what the majority wanted to do. And again, looking back, if I had the opportunity to kind of switch streams, I think I'm still pretty happy with the decision I made. I definitely, now that I have my friends, who are CPAs and CFAs, etc., I definitely don't see myself enjoying the career or the roles that they're doing. But it's great to have them in my network, because it really allows me to have a holistic understanding of all aspects of the business.
Cool. And if we take a bit of time to just kind of walk through that kind of familial discussion, because I know a lot of folks have to deal with, well, mom and dad or family wants you or expects
Right.
you to do one thing, and then you have an interest or passion in something else. Like, how do those kind of true up? And what was like the conversations like? How did you make that decision? How did you talk to them in regards to making your decision? If you don't mind elaborating a little bit on that.
Absolutely. I'm coming from an Asian background, really most of Asia for that matter. There is sort of a predetermined life set out for you. Typical conversations about going into lucrative niche careers like a doctor, engineer, etc. And I would say my family was no different in that sense, where that was the initial push that they were hoping for. But I think this again kind of goes back to that rebellious theme. I think there was a certain point after which my family realized that my passions would outweigh any of their ideas. And I think this happened through a series of conversations, right? It wasn't a one big dramatic conversation that took place. But I think over the course of the years, after them trying to push me in certain career paths, for example, medicine, and still to this day, I get remarks that, oh, Narsingh, you would have been a great doctor. It's unfortunate you didn't choose that path, but so there's still a little bit of fun and games in that regard. But I think it was really just a matter of understanding what it is that you think would be best for you in the long term and sticking to that. Because when you think about it, this is more of a parental bias, and this kind of comes a little bit because of the studies that I did in psychology. A lot of these come from projections of what parents could and couldn't do, and part of it is them wanting the best for their kids, but it's also because it's something that they weren't able to achieve, or something that they think is the right thing to do based on what the current societal forces are telling them it to
Right.
be. And I think personally, getting a little bit into the deeper side of things, it's very important to kind of be happy with the decisions that you make, and those
Mhm.
decisions should be for yourself, not for anybody else, regardless of how important they might be. Because once the story's ending, you're going to look back at the decisions you made, and if they were all for other people, you're probably not going to be happy about it. So I think it's super critical to kind of make decisions for yourself and your expected benefit, because then you're also able to sleep with it better.
For sure. Yeah, and understanding that the decisions that you make have consequences. Like, I mean,
Of
consequences
course.
not necessarily in a bad way, but sometimes
Mhm.
in a good way. But understanding that if your parents want you to go one direction and you want to go to a different direction, oftentimes the conversation with mom and dad is just that, you know what, I have a clear path and understanding on how to
Right.
get where I want to go, even though you have a different view, because I mean, doctor, engineering, all that stuff is safe. Everyone knows what will happen. But in this other, like marketing or any of these new and upcoming fields that mom and dad have, and even some of us have no understanding of, then
Mhm.
it's really having that comfort to say, you know what, my child, my son, my daughter will be independent and self-sustaining, and then they won't have to live with me for the entire life, that sort of thing, and then not be able to take care
Exactly.
of themselves. Most parents just want you to be happy and independent and be able to
Exactly.
kind of function in society, that sort of thing, right? So, but understanding that, yeah, you don't want to necessarily piss off mom and dad, right?
Exactly. Yeah. No,
But
it's go ahead.
no, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say it's really important to kind of help them understand why it is you're deciding to not take their advice or their recommendation. And like you said, as long as you have a clear plan and a passion behind it, it's difficult for any parent to really say no.
Yeah. And it's also being able to kind of come back and say, you know what, mom and dad, you were right, because sometimes your assumptions are wrong, and you have
Right.
to go back and again, maybe it's not going to their particular path, but it's coming up with like, and being able to address some of their concerns that they have. So
Mhm.
I think that's a good conversation. Maybe we can delve a little bit deeper in a future episode. But now that we kind of go back and say, okay, you're in university, you pick marketing, and you're approaching kind of graduation. What was that journey like, and how do we get from there to Unilever?
Yeah, well, that's a that's a pretty long-winded journey. Um, when I was at U of T, I was part of the co-op program, and so I started off my career in big tech, at Microsoft, and it was one of those critical decisions that I had to make, going into the end of my university career in terms of where I wanted to go next. Because obviously, having a company like Microsoft on your resume makes it a little bit easier for you to really go wherever you want.
Right.
And that being said, I think for me it was important to figure out whether I wanted to go back into big corporate, try something else, or maybe even start something up for my own.
Mhm.
And I'd actually experimented in the last year of university. I'd actually started up an agency with a couple of my friends.
Mhm.
We were able to secure a couple of clients and we did a few projects, but we weren't really sure in terms of how to scale it. So that project kind of dissolved closer to my graduation, but it was still a pretty fun thing to try. But
Mhm.
after university, I think the decision I made was to actually go into small business,
Mhm.
and part of that came from really trying to get an understanding of what different business models, different business sizes looked like, how they behaved, how they operated. And so what I thought was it would be interesting for me to really become a student by exposing myself A to multiple different industries, and B exposing myself to different org sizes and try to solve problems at all levels.
Okay.
So after graduation, I kind of went into a small business. It was an agency, 15 to 20 people. Really expanded my horizon in terms of what it means to do business development. How do you grow your client base? How do you hire and fire people? How do you deal with operational problems? Probably one of the best and most important um, um, forms of education that I could have gotten. And then I kind of, moved into three other industries after, in terms of, a little bit bigger org sizes. I even worked for a startup for, where there were 3 to 5 people in the healthcare tech space. And then finally, my last role was actually in a real estate firm that was growing rapidly, and still are across the US and Canada. Much bigger org size, much more defined, before I finally kind of decided to come back into, the bigger corporate environment.
Walk us through a little bit about kind of that decision, because there's always a discussion on whether, should I work at a big company where like the brand helps kind of sell me out to the working world, versus, you know what, I want to go small so that I can basically do anything and everything. So
Right.
it seems like that you were able to get best of both worlds, and I encourage folks to actually sample both, right? So
Right.
whether you go small and then big or big and then small, it's really a decision that's up to you. But I encourage you to explore both realms. And if you can talk to us a little bit about kind of your experience in terms of like the differences between big versus small, what you like, what you didn't like, and obviously it's not necessarily just big versus small, but there are individual variances in the companies, but just in generalities, what would you say to folks that are looking for that big company experience, or the folks that are looking for the small, tiny company experience? What sort of advice and guidance would you have around those two?
Yeah, it's, starting off with the decision itself, it was extremely difficult. I might have made it sound like a pretty straightforward decision for me, but there's that struggle to kind of let go of what is comfortable, predictable, to go into a completely unknown dark area right after graduation was pretty difficult for me. But I think I had a good hypothesis, and luckily that prediction worked out in terms of what I was hoping to get out of this career path. And to kind of speak to some of the differences between big versus small versus mid-size, I think a lot of it has to do with impact. A lot of it has to do with your exposure and transparency to other functions in the business. So, when I was in it, when I was in a startup, for example, where we had, just a few people, and lots of other like external agencies, et cetera, sort of helping other aspects of the business, I pretty much knew everything about the business, from the the top line, bottom line, the financials, who we were hiring next. I was involved in the hiring process from the beginning. It's a very different environment than corporate, where most of the stuff is already done for you and you're kind of focusing on very particular areas. So you're really the master of your craft, and you're kind of doubling down on making sure you're excelling in that craft. Not to say that a big business does not allow you to explore. Obviously, if you have other interests and passions, it's relatively easy actually to move within the business, because at the end of the day, longevity to a business means more than anything else. So especially in today's era where people are, jumping around at the drop of a hat, it's important for businesses to retain employees.
Right.
And if that means exposing them to different functional expertise, then, they're obviously willing to do that. But, just kind of wrapping up in terms of those key differences, there's probably until you become relatively bigger in your role in a corporate environment, I think it's very hard to compare the impact that you can have in a small business. To give you an example, for me to grow my lead base in triple digits year over year is something that is relatively a lot easier for me to do in a small business.
Sure.
Less rules, less process, less operational restrictions. You can really just run with it. And whereas there's a lot more rules and regulations in terms of how to be able to execute on a very similar task in a bigger organization. So I think that impact component is always going to be part of the conversation, and also just having less restrictions, which allows you to do more.
Right. Yeah. So I chalk that up to, I guess, a personal decision in terms of like, what do you have in terms of a preference, right? So sometimes you want that impact, and you want to know that you're making a difference because to grow something like triple digits every quarter, year, or whatever, you can definitely do that in a small. But I mean, to do that in something like Unilever, that would be just a ridiculous number that you would have to post out, right? So it depends on that. And then the other thing is that it can also change over time, right? So it might be early in your career where you want that flexibility and that exposure to a whole bunch of different things. And then later on, you want to settle down, and then you get bored and then go back, right? So it doesn't have to be a decision one way or the other. It could be a change, and hopefully it's not a change like at the drop of a hat, as you mentioned, but there's a little bit more discussion and some thought behind it. But I think that's a lot of great exposure. But I'd love to go back and talk to about some of the SWIKE, the stuff I wish I knew earlier. If you could go back and talk to young Narsingh in various points of his career, what's some of the advice that you would share for yourself?
Yeah, let me think about that. Well, I do think that in order to kind of, making some of these decisions, we sometimes overthink things that are relatively simple. And what I mean by that is, I wish when I was younger, or even, some days today, I remind myself, nobody really knows what they're doing.
Yep.
Everyone is kind of figuring it out as they go. And having that level of perspective helps you feel more comfortable in your own shoes. There is no right path. You can study, the biggest, entrepreneurs in the last 100 years, and everyone's path was different. There are some commonalities, but it's relatively unique. Luck is always a big part of it. Network is a part of it. So, there's certainly no path that, if I could write it for you, you could become the next Elon Musk, because that doesn't exist. And so what that means is, I wish when I was younger, someone would have told me early on that, hey, be more comfortable in terms of what you're doing. Things will fall into place as long as you have your fundamentals right. The way I think about it is, it's much more important to build your character than for you to do the right things. If you have a good character, the right things will happen for you. So focus on defining yourself as a person, what you like, what you don't like, and then really, I'm a strong believer in the world is always conspiring to help you if you let it.
Right. Yeah, I think those are definitely good words of wisdom. Where, yeah, most people don't know what they're doing, and the other ones that do pretend to are probably just fronting it,
Exactly.
trying to make it seem, putting on a brave face to do that. But some people have a confidence where they feel that they know, and other people have to learn that along the way. So I like what you said about like there is really no right path, and what I would add to that is the path is really as right as you decide to make it, right? Because you can always second guess your decisions, right? And then that is a path to a lot of anxiety and stress. Or you can say, you know what, I made this decision, so how do I make this the best decision that I could possibly have, right? And then grow, and then you might choose to do something different and go back to the path that you had before, but you hopefully learned a lot along the way. And I think that leads to your second point about kind of building yourself and your character, where I think one of the best investments that you can make is in you, right? So that is the thing where, I mean, you could invest it in some sort of marketing, Bitcoin, NFT, or whatever, and it could go to zero tomorrow. But if you are always investing in yourself, then you are hopefully better than you were yesterday. And then the compound interest of that kind of continues there. And then again, it goes back to making sense of that decision and what you built. And then now what can I do with kind of these characteristics, these new habits, these new mindsets, or whatever it is that you built in yourself, and continue to grow. So I think that's a lot of great and useful advice, Narsingh. And if you can share some of your future aspirations, and then maybe where can folks connect with you if they want to learn more about you?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I guess in terms of connecting with me, LinkedIn probably the easiest platform to find me and connect. In terms of future aspirations, I'm still continuing down the journey of, really becoming a well-rounded marketer. So, I think Unilever is probably one of the best places you can be. They've really over-engineered, I would say, marketing and what it stands today from a global scale. And thinking way ahead, unless things kind of evolve in a different direction. At some point in my career, I would probably want to go back to entrepreneurship to
Okay.
really try that space out and see what it's like to be fully accountable for everything in terms of what that organization can do. But I think that calling is going to come, at some point, and so I would say that's probably somewhere down my career path. And one thing that probably not a lot of people know, but since we're talking about it, is I have thought about teaching, ever since I was in university. So I would
Okay.
hope to kind of teach, at some capacity, whether that's in front of a college audience or even university at some point in my career.
Sounds good. Sounds like a lot of things to look forward to, and hopefully we'll be able to catch up with you and get some updates on that. But thanks so much, Narsingh, for sharing your journey, and hopefully we'll have you back for a future episode.
Absolutely, I'm more than happy to be back. Thanks again for having me, Luki. Hopefully, some of these topics we discussed do end up helping the right people.
Sounds good. Take care.
All right, thanks.
Thanks for joining us on the SWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Luki Danu, LUKIDANU, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.